Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 10 class. We're in Unit 3.1, The World at War, Part B, The Russian Revolution. Main self-test questions to keep in mind. What were the causes of the Russian Revolution, i.e. what were the historical circumstances of this and or the Communist Revolution? What were the effects of the Communist Revolution? How did it impact? How was it significant on the lives of the Russian people or perhaps even the greater world stage? What reforms or changes did Vladimir Lenin put into place in the new Soviet Union? And what was the NEP? What were its goals? What were the effects of the NEP? There is an excellent Yale lecture that explores this concept if you want to take a deeper dive and have greater mastery over this content, or there's a shorter video that also does an excellent job covering these concepts as well. So we want to plan out the roadmap to this revolution and explore the varying causes. There are, in my opinion, and as a general rule, the opinion of the Global Studies regions too, many similarities that can be drawn between the causes of the French Revolution and the causes of the Russian Revolution, or really any revolution that is going to have, certain things that the populace, the greater people, are unhappy with that causes them to revolt. So let's take a look at these in Russia. Russia, at the time of revolution, at the eve of revolution, was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, who reigned from 1896 until 1917. And he ruled as an autocrat. So he wielded all of the political power, right? Autokratia, the rule of one or rule by oneself. And this is him as an individual. He is a person that has shown up in political cartoons, so would be helpful to be able to recognize what he looks like. And he strongly believes that the Tsar should have all of the control. He still arguably believes in the concept of divine right. We could argue that after Catherine the Great in Russia, the concepts and the ideas of the Enlightenment kind of die out. You've got this great quote from him: "The principle of autocracy will be maintained by me as firmly as by my father." And he did not believe the people were able to rule well. He was a believer in Tsarist rule, this concept of autokratia, or rule of oneself. He used the Okhrana, a secret police, to intimidate and oppress people. They frequently arrested political dissidents. That means someone who disagrees with the government. Some were just straight up executed, like this one, who was just thrown against a brick wall and shot. Others were hung, and many were also banished to Siberia, literally just a forced migration out to these prison camps out in the cold wastelands of Siberia in Russia, and either they died in these wastelands or they just worked in hard labor. In Russia at this time, there are few and no individual rights and freedoms. There is no freedom of the press. There is no real voting. There's no real protection or fair trials. And Russia practiced a policy of very strict censorship over media, banning books, newspapers, pamphlets, and letters, as well as arresting people who were thought to spread kind of seditious material or material against the Tsar and against the Russian autocracy. There were at times pogroms. While Tsar Nicholas II did not unleash the worst of these, they were an element of Tsarist rule that was religious persecution of minorities, specifically Jews and Muslims, as well as some ethnic minorities like the Cossacks at times as well. Though we do see under Tsar Nicholas II, the Cossacks had a decent relationship with the Tsarist regime. You see this policy of Russification. That was resented by nationalist groups, where the Tsars tried to make others in their empire, because it is the Russian Empire, more like Russia's. And that's difficult to unite this diverse empire. There were people who wanted to reform Russia. There were people that wanted to make it more like perhaps England, with a monarch, sure, but an invested parliamentary force that would have certain powers, or at least, a legislative body that the Tsar would have to go into conference with, or some elements of making this system more fair or more open or more just. And Nicholas saw all of these as really attempts by the rabble or attempts by dissidents or even attempts by anarchists to change the government. And Nicholas II was very much against the ideas of the common people. When he was younger, a young child, 13 years old, he had witnessed a brutal bombing assassination of his grandfather, Tsar Alexander II. They were traveling to mass, to church, and a group of anarchist assassins, people wanted to tear the Russian government down, to start anew, used a series of basically briefcase bombs, and he witnessed his grandfather killed, and it was not a fast death. He saw his grandfather's guts blown out by these bombs and trying to hold his intestines, and witnessed his grandfather dying of these horrific wounds, these bomb wounds. So he has arguably no real love for these people that want to change the government. He views them as dangerous, radical elements. There are also, as there were in France, political and economic inequalities that lead to resentment of the Tsarist regime. In Russia, there is a strict social class system. You have the Tsar land-owning nobles called boyars, right? Boyars at the top, as well as a politically and often economically powerful class of upper priests. Not like your average priest, but the equivalent of bishops and cardinals and that sort of thing in the Eastern Orthodox Church. You have a middle class, but the growth economically and as a portion of population was kind of repressed. Unlike Great Britain, which kind of advocated for the growth of the middle class, in Russia, very much it was repressed because the middle class oftentimes argues for change, wants more political change. Think about the French Revolution. It was many times the third estate middle class and the wealthy in the third estate that tried to advocate for change the most. Most people in Russia at the time were either poor peasants or poor laborers. Now, serfdom had ended in 1861, but the life of the peasants, the former serfs, did not get much better. And in fact, it could be argued from certain standpoints, it had gotten worse even though they were now freed. The Tsar and the nobility living opulent lives in their mansions and palaces with their mistresses and their alcohol and their parties and their feasts and their dances, they were very frequently seen as out of touch with the commoners. They were out of touch with the commoners. They're not just seen, they are. They have no idea what the struggle is like for an actual Russian laborer or an actual Russian peasant. They had no idea. There was limited industrialization in Russia, and unlike Japan, which industrialized, but then avoided the worst of industrialization, let's not do child labor, let's not have overcrowded, horrible cities. In Russia, they did all the bad stuff. They have very poor working conditions, very low wages, and an increasing gap between the rich and poor. And arguably, industrialization hadn't really provided enough jobs to give everyone a job. In addition to this, you have the document written in 1848, the Communist Manifesto, that had been circulating throughout Europe for now many decades. And within the laborers and even within a middle class, it planted these ideas that a classless society for workers, by workers, of workers could exist, and that would be much more just and fair. Another element that did lead to political dissatisfaction with the Tsarist regime of Nicholas II was this guy, Grigorovich Rasputin. He was a non-ordained monk and mystic. He was basically illiterate, but he insinuated himself into the Russian court, i.e. the Tsarist family, and many nobles as well that lived in St. Petersburg, the capital. And he was, he slept with a bunch of nobles' wives and daughters. Supposedly, he said he had healing powers, and the firstborn son of the Tsar was a hemophiliac. His blood would not clot properly, and this caused him aches and pains and horrific bruises. And every time he got a cut as a child playing outside, it was a terrifying nightmare of whether he would die or not. And Rasputin appeared to be able to heal this child, to alleviate his pain and alleviate the worst conditions of his bleeding. And the reality was, doctors at the time kept prescribing this kid aspirin, which thins the blood even more. Now, they did this to help with the child's pain. They didn't know it had this blood thinning element as well. So they actually made his hemophilia much worse, even though they took away some of his pain. Rasputin was like, listen, I don't believe in doctors. I heal through God. God is working through me as a channel. I will heal your boy. No doctors anymore. And the Tsar and the Tsarina, his wife, trying to do anything to help their child, they did what he was told, and they didn't allow the doctors to give this kid medication. And so, like, Rasputin looked like he was making the hemophilia better because the kid wasn't bleeding as much. The bruising went away quicker, and even though the kid still felt some pain because the bruising wasn't there as long, he overall felt better. And famously, Rasputin told the Tsarina, if I die or you desert me, in 6 months you will lose your son and your throne. And he was eventually killed by a group of nobles who didn't like him. He was poisoned, stabbed, strangled, beaten, and finally thrown into a river. And in 6 months, the Russian Revolution had happened, and in fact, his prophecy had come true. So really interesting figure there. So now we're continuing to climb. These are the reasons. You've got absolute or autocratic rule, political and social inequality, economic inequality, all these bad things going around. Now we're going to look at the events that start moving us closer and closer revolution. Now, there are several stages to this Russian Revolution, and kids always have a hard time keeping these straight, so I'm going to try to be as clear as possible. One of these key stages is known as Bloody Sunday. This occurs 12 years before the actual Russian Revolution, 13 years before the Communist Revolution. All right, this occurs in 1905. It is a reaction to the loss of the Russo-Japanese War, right? 1904, 1905, Russo-Japanese War. And it's motivated by an economic downturn. So Russia loses this war. The Tsar is unpopular because they lost the war. There are sons, brothers, and fathers not coming home. Russian casualties were very, very high. The loss of the war, the overproduction of war material, leading to a lack of consumer goods, all of this contributes to an economic downturn. There is rising unemployment, especially in the cities like St. Petersburg. The war increased food prices, as they frequently do, because you're sending so much food to the front to help soldiers. There is inflation of prices. The uneven industrialization led to, again, unemployment in some elements of Russia. And so there is a protest march. 200,000 workers and families led by an incredibly popular priest, Father Gapon, Georgy Gapon. And Gapon was a popular priest to the poor people. Like, he was one, he's like, oh, I heard this family's sick. I'm going to stop by and pray over their child. I heard this family, the father lost his job. I'm going to stop by with a couple loaves of bread. This guy was among the commoners. He was a face amongst the common people and beloved by the commoners. And he organizes this protest to petition, to ask the Tsar for help and relief. What these protesters were hoping for: laws for better working conditions, more personal freedoms, and they wanted an elected national legislature. They also wanted lower food prices, lower coal prices, and other changes like that. And even though the Tsar wasn't actually at the Winter Palace, it was still going to be defended by the Royal Guard. And this leads us to our bloody. The Tsarist soldiers fired on the crowd, killing between 130 and 1,000 unarmed protesters. I'd like to be very clear. These protesters, the only thing they had in their hand was a petition to the Tsar, a letter to the Tsar. And as they moved near the palace, they were gunned down by the royal guard, by soldiers of the Tsarist regime. This is a massacre. It is violence against protesters. Human rights violation. I mean, yes, we consider the right to peacefully protest a human right. So it definitely could be considered a human rights violation, but it's violence against protesters, violence against reformers. Once word that the Tsar's troops, instead of listening to an actual complaint, a very real complaint of the people, that they fired into literally an unarmed crowd. Again, these people weren't screaming and waving sticks and stuff. They were peacefully marching, overseen by priests of the Eastern Orthodox Church. What you saw is strikes and revolutions around Russia. Workers closed off roads, seized arms whenever they could, raised the flag of revolution. They were ticked. And so in order to calm people down, Tsar Nicholas issues what was called the October Manifesto. All right, this calmed people down and kind of ended this micro-revolution. It said, we are going to give people rights, right? The right of conscience, voting, assembly, speech, and freedom of press. We're going to allow voting for a Duma, Russia's parliament or legislature. And we're going to make sure that no laws can be passed without the Duma's consent. And so the protests are peacefully ended. The revolutions, these people are like, oh, okay, we got everything we wanted. There was an air of jubilation. The Russian people wanted to believe that the Tsar was good. The average Russian person was like, the Tsar's good. He has our best interest at heart. There are bad people around him. There's bad advisors or bad nobles or bad military commanders or Rasputins around him. And if the Tsar only knew how the people suffered, he would, of course, act rightly. Generally, people like the Tsar. So when he promises them all these things in this October Manifesto, they're like, awesome, great. But the reality is, Tsar Nicholas had no intention of giving them any of these things. By 1907, Tsar Nicholas had revoked or not followed through on literally all of these promises, repudiating all of them. Between 1904 and 1914, Tsar Nicholas continued to refuse and reject any meaningful government changes. So there's this 10-year period that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on, except for to say he didn't change anything. We got this great quote from him. I shall never agree to a representative form of government because I consider it harmful to the people whom God has entrusted to my care. So again, you have the ideas of autocracy, the ideas of divine right, the ideas of absolutism, all here in this passage by Tsar Nicholas II. And then you have World War I break out in 1914. And World War I is a disaster for Russia, and World War I will definitely be a disaster for the Tsar's family. So now we have new causes for revolution. These are the causes that are actually going to hardcore lead to the quote-unquote Russian Revolution. World War I plays a huge part in this. So do all the other ones, the autocracy, the social, political, and economic inequality. But World War I kind of acts as a spark or maybe not the spark, but kind of acts as a tipping point in the scale of revolution. So let's get into it. Russia, more or less, was kind of unprepared to fight a modern war. I mean, there's a lot of historical argument on this. Some people are like, no, Russia did pretty good in the beginning, They really didn't, all right? They had terrible leadership. Many of their generals were promoted because they were members of high-ranking noble families. They had no real battlefield skill. I mean, look at the last war they fought in 1905. They lost disastrously. They generally had inferior training, especially when you compare it to their enemies in the German army. Austro-Hungarians were about equal, but the Germans were nasty, way better at fighting. They had overall inadequate weapons and supplies. So they're not sending the same amount of food. They don't have the same ammo capacity. They don't have the same logistics. They haven't industrialized as heavily, so they can't mass produce stuff quite as well. They don't have as many miles of trains, so they can't send supplies as easily to the front. And as the war dragged on, they had by far some of the highest casualties. All right. Brutal casualties. 1.7 million. You're like, oh yeah, Germany is higher. Sure, Germany is higher. Germany also lost the war and were fighting on two fronts. Remember, they were fighting on the Western and the Eastern Front, and they fought for a whole another year longer than Russia did. So these are really high casualties. Because of the brutally high casualties, morale was low because they got defeated over and over again, because they had terrible leadership, because there were shortages of supplies, not just on the front, but also on the home front. So now you have your soldiers, they're starving, right? Here's an old German political cartoon showing that they're getting an entire Russian unit to surrender just by offering them a sausage and some food and some old potatoes. They are running out of food on the front, and then they get a letter from, Svetlana at home, their sister, their wife, whatever, and it says, we're also low on food, or we're low on coal, or the government today came and took half of our crops. And so that is terrifying these soldiers. Not only are they hungry, but they're also hearing that their families are going hungry. And all of this economic squeeze and food price increases lead to inflation, which makes it harder and harder for people to afford food, coal, anything. So now we'll be talking about the actual spark of the revolution. All right, this is the March Revolution. This is the first part of our Russian Revolution, 1917. There is another protest. Workers and urban laborers strike over shortages of bread and fuel, coal. All right, it's March, it's cold, Russia's super cold. They don't have enough coal to cook their food or heat their apartments. And so there's this big protest march scheduled for International Women's Day because it's the wives, the wives are like, our men are off fighting, we're suffering, we're trying to keep the household together, and it's tough. And what you see is the soldiers in St. Petersburg are ordered to crush this protest. But instead, like we saw in France on Bastille Day, many of the soldiers join the rebellion. All right, instead of, they're looking out in this crowd and they're like, man, that's Bill down the street. That's Utrana. I always see her in the grocery store. She's nice. I know she got 3 kids. I can't shoot at these people. So the soldiers join the rebellion, being advised that, you have no one on your side. Tsar Nicholas II abdicates. He gives up the throne. So this march happens, this protest march happens on March 8th. That's the beginning of the Russian Revolution. Within a week, Tsar Nicholas and his family, they're not the Tsar anymore. They give up the throne. And that entire family will be executed within 1 year. So like Louis XVI of France, Tsar Nicholas II will also be executed by radical revolutionaries. So now what? No more Tsar. What do we do? Well, the Duma, the parliament that Russia was supposed to have, which did have members, the Tsar never listened to them, and the military set up a provisional or temporary government. That's a word I want you to know because it's a word that's going to come up more and more. When you have a revolution, frequently there'll be some sort of temporary, i.e. provisional government that's set up under a guy named Alexander Kerensky. He was seen as kind of a moderate, not too left-winging, not too right-leaning. He'd probably be pretty decent at government. A lot of people thought, that guy's all right. However, he makes a serious mistake, and the provisional government doesn't work that well either. One of his biggest mistakes is he refuses to exit World War I. He was not good at reading the pulse of the Russian people. They did not understand why they were fighting this war. They did not want to fight this war anymore. But his opinion was, well, the Germans are on the ropes. If we can just eke through the end, if we leave the war before it's won, we won't get any reparations. We won't get any land. We'll be cut out of the peace negotiations. This will be bad for us. We gotta win. We gotta keep fighting. We gotta support our allies. And the Duma is also weak. It doesn't really have full control over the country. It is slow to reform. It's not really listening to the changes the people were demanding. And most importantly, it was unable to provide supplies or lower inflation. So the big things people were angry about, the commoners were angry about. I ain't got no food, ain't got no coal, food prices are too high, we need changes, and I don't want to fight this war. They didn't do any of those things. So, at the same time the Duma is trying to be in control, you have the creation of these things called Soviets. Please star these. Soviets were local councils of workers, peasants, and your actual soldiers, like your grunts on the ground. Not officers, though there were some officers in them, but your average soldier. Now, at the end of the day, these were the people. They're actually listening to the people. They're more powerful and more popular than the provisional government. And they found more support amongst the people because they are the people. They're actually meeting and voting and having democracy and trying to make changes. And so what you end up with is this period of dual power. The Duma's like the actual quote unquote government of Russia, but the Soviets, these local councils in every major city, Moscow had one, Novorossiysk had one, Novgorod had one. Obviously, St. Petersburg had a very powerful Soviet. They are competing for power and influence over the common people. So keep this in mind. The Soviets actually are the people. The Duma are your wealthy, your upper class, your upper middle class. And the Duma wants to stay in the war. The Soviets don't want to. At the same time, there is arguably a third group coming into this situation. All right, these are the communists. And the communists in Russia were organizing for revolution as well. They saw this chaos and this political instability as an opportunity to get stuff done. Now, within the Communist Party, there were two main groups. And you're going to see one of these, even though they're the losing group, they show up in a lot of documents. So one of these groups were called the Mensheviks. It means the minority because they'd arguably lost the voting, the main votes for power in this Communist Party of Russia. They said, and their opinion was, that revolution needed more industrialization and capitalism to occur in Russia, that Russia wasn't industrialized and capitalistic enough, that it was not the right time for a workers' revolution because you have to have wide-based support for revolution. And their leader was a guy named Leon Trotsky. There is a picture of him. He does show up in political cartoons sometimes. And he later realizes that his party's like losing control, so he joins the other party, the Bolsheviks. This is the main one to remember. Please star the heck out of them and highlight them. The Bolsheviks are the one that eventually come out winning this Russian Revolution. Their name literally translates to the majority. Here's the deal with the Bolsheviks. They believed revolution must and can come from a small group of radicals who are willing to sacrifice everything to make radical change. So instead of a worldwide or Russia-wide workers' revolution, they believe a small group of armed and focused individuals can grab control for themselves. And their leader was Vladimir Ivanovich Lenin. All right, he was an expert organizer, an excellent orator or public speaker, and a ruthless radical revolutionary, believing in the ability of a small group of focused individuals to take power. Now, his brother had been exiled and executed for political dissidence by the Tsar. He had been exiled numerous times to Sweden and Germany. And then as this revolution and chaos is unfolding in Russia, the Germans are like, hey, bro, we're going to give you a one-way train ticket back to Russia. Start stirring the pot. And if you win, we're going to sign a peace treaty between Germany and Russia, and you get to pull out of the war. And, it's Germany, it's win-win. Like, at best, this guy's going to cause chaos and anarchy, or at worst, that's what he's going to do. At best, he'll take control, and they get a peace treaty with Russia. So, that is an interesting element of their decision to do this. So, Germany sends Vladimir Lenin back to Russia, April 1917, hoping that Lenin would destabilize the Duma, destabilize the Russian war effort, and that worked out well for them. He begins a widespread campaign speaking to the Soviets of major cities, spreading support for the workers, gaining support of the workers, of the peasants, using propaganda. And this is his big motto: peace, land, bread. He promised the Soviets, the workers' councils, everything they wanted. Peace. I'm going to pull Russia out of World War I. You say you don't want to fight anymore? Bam, I will do that. Land. I'm going to redistribute land, taking it from the wealthy, taking it from the boyars and nobles, and giving it to the peasants. Land reform, right? That's a big deal. Peasants always want that. And bread. I'm going to make sure the cities, the Soviets, are fed with bread. We're going to give the workers food. There's going to be no more inflation. And what happens is he wins control over Soviet after Soviet after Soviet. These councils are on his side. And so in October 1918, he basically seizes power. He has his little soldiers on his side, members of the Soviets who are on his side. They seize power over St. Petersburg, which is the capital. They march on the Winter Palace, and the Duma, which had been holed up in the Winter Palace, instead of fighting it out, they basically led. So this is a coup d'etat. They overthrow by a small group of radicals, like Napoleon's coup d'etat. And this is known as the Red October, because the flag of the Soviets, the flag of the communists, was this red flag. So now you've had the Russian Revolution in 1917, and now you've had this Bolshevik Revolution. Two different events, but related in time. Keep that stuff in mind. Now the Soviets are in charge. Now the Bolsheviks are in charge. Lenin and the Soviet Bolsheviks, once in power, honestly start going about what they had promised. They begin seizing some farmland and redistributing it to the peasants. They gave control over many of the factories to the workers, and they negotiated peace with Germany. This is known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and it ended World War I for Russia. So that's why they, we talked about nations entering next to the war in World War I. That's why they pull out 1917, 1918. But Russia surrendered a huge amount of territory in this treaty. Huge chunks of land were given over to Germany. And that arguably, people start to criticize Lenin. This caused anger at Lenin, anger at the Bolsheviks. Like, why are you so weak that you're not strengthening us? You're giving up land. We wanted peace, but not to lose all this territory. And what then erupts is known as the Russian Civil War, a 2-year devastating conflict, just utterly devastating and brutal to Russia, as though they had not lost enough. Who is in this war? Who's fighting? Who are the two main sides? Well, you have the White Army. These are the aristocrats. These are loyalists to the Tsar and nobles. Many of them are members of the officer corps, so your upper-ranking people. And they're led by Alexander Kerensky, who was, again, that leader of the Duma. At least they're led by him at first. The middle class sided with them as well, because they didn't really care for these peasants and laborers crashing around and looting. Some elements of the army joined it, like I said, the officer corps, as well as the Cossacks. The Cossacks were those hardcore kind of cavalry guys. They lived out in the steppe. They were just really tough as nails. And the Duma basically promised them all sorts of independence, essentially, like more autonomy and control. And they just sided with the whites. And also, Other Western nations like the US and Great Britain sent expeditionary forces, thousands of soldiers, to try to stabilize this. Why? We did not want a communist government. And that was the other side. This is the Red Army, and they are quote unquote communists, though, I have some mild issues with that. Their leaders, Vladimir Lenin, right, the leader of the Bolshevik Party, and Trotsky, who now has switched sides from the Menshevik Party to the Bolshevik Party, and he becomes the war commissar. So he's kind of like actually the one overseeing like the day-to-day fighting, and he won a lot of accolades for doing that. Now, the Red Army has the support of the peasants and the workers, and that's why they eventually win. So why do they win? They have the support of the peasants and workers because they promised them everything they wanted. Still, it is a civil war. That means just about everyone that's dying is a Russian. And this war happens in a time period where there's already food shortages, where there's already shortages of supplies. And so over this 2-year course, another 15 million Russians die. That's not all soldiers. Most of those are civilians dying in famine, and some of which died in massacres. And, the White Army thought they were fighting to preserve Russia, the autocracy, or preserve maybe a republic, some of them. There's the Cossacks charging in. The Red Army thought, here they are with their gun, a broom of bayonets, sweeping out the corrupt White Army and sweeping out these Europeans who are interfering. In order to fight this war and win, Lenin needs food, supplies. He needs to keep the cities happy, the laborers happy, and he needs to keep the factories turning out war material, and he needs to keep his army, his Red Army, his soldiers happy and fed. So this results in a policy known as war communism or wartime communism, Prodratsvyotska, surplus appropriation system. If you remember war communism, you're just fine. You don't have to remember this specific Russian name. So a policy enacted by Lenin and the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. Its goal, win the Russian Civil War by keeping towns, cities, and the Red Army supplied with food and weapons. The Bolsheviks knew that was their power base. That, the peasants in the countryside are quote unquote important, but it's the Soviets, right, these workers' councils workers and soldiers' councils in the cities, in the towns, in the urban centers that have more power because there's more people, it's more concentrated. They can more violently react if they're not happy. So this is wartime communism. The government controls all industry. They take basically control of the factories back. Strikes were forbidden. There is no striking for better pay and better work. We need to churn out weapons and supplies to win. They had forced grain requisitions. That means they take any food surpluses. There is labor duty and forced labor on the countryside peasants. Private businesses, private markets are banned. We do not want people selling or holding on to things and selling it for a higher price. That'll hurt the economy. That'll hurt the war effort. So here's a little graphic to help you out with war communism. You got a farmer. He grows 10 tons. Well, the government says your family of 5 only needs 1 ton of grain for a year to survive. So the government takes all surplus, hence surplus appropriation system. So what do you think happened? Farmers stopped working as hard. They're always going to be left with 1 ton, or at least that's the theory. So they're only going to grow 1 ton. The government doesn't have anything to take, and bam, the farmer gets to keep his 1 ton. That's the theory here. And you see farming productivity go sink down. On the other hand, oftentimes when the government came to collect their grain, if you only had 1 ton, they took the 1 ton. If you tried to hide food, they shot you as a traitor and enemy of the Bolshevik state. So pretty violent stuff, pretty horrific. Shockingly, taking a bunch of people's food is going to lead to famines, which again is one of the reasons why 15 million Russians die during this civil war. What are the effects of wartime communism? Successful parts of it, the Red Army remained better supplied than the whites. That allows them to win the Russian Civil War. So you could argue that without this policy, the Bolsheviks wouldn't have won. The quote unquote communists would not have won. Other elements of it, the unsuccessful elements, it led to huge food shortages and famines. All right, an additional 3 to 6 million deaths between 1921 and 1922. Because even after the war was won, when people stopped, the farmers stopped working as hard, stopped farming as much, because they're like, what's the point? The government's going to take it anyways. That just meant, period, there was less food. So this less growing led to nightmarish famines. I mean, here's an article from the Chicago American, an American newspaper, and they knew about this. 6 million perish in Soviet famine. Peasants' crops seized, they and their animals starve. You have dying horses. I mean, what are you going to feed, a horse or a person first? This led to rebellions and strikes against Bolshevik rule now. So now they're putting down other rebellions of workers and peasants and stuff. There were 118 minor rebellions in February of 1921 alone. What does Lenin do? He sends in the Red Army and they crush these mini rebellions. But a huge effect of this is reduced productivity. Coal production goes down by 75%. Food production goes down by 50%. Finished manufactured goods go down by nearly 90%. The ruble, which is the currency, it utterly collapses. Not just inflation, the currency is effectively worthless. And so black markets spring up, barter, you do a favor for me, I'll do a favor for you, begins to dominate business because the money was just utterly unreliable. So they've won the Civil War, but at what cost? This leads to some major changes under this communist or Bolshevik rule. So communist Russia under Lenin and the Bolsheviks, what did it look like? Lenin and the Bolsheviks want to consolidate power. That means they're grabbing in the coup, and now they have to consolidate or maintain power. How do you do that? You purge the political opposition. So what they unleash is known as, one of many, red terrors. They're going to eliminate any other political parties, any other members of even dissenting communist members. And their goal is to create a one-party government, which they do. So there will only be the Bolshevik Communist Party. That's the only political man left standing. Lenin, through this red terror that lasts nearly 5 years, it is occurring during the Russian Civil War and extends after it. The Bolsheviks create a secret police. You like how these Russians revolted against the Tsar's secret police just to now have an even worse secret police known as the Cheka. And the Cheka carry out these purges. They arrest over 70,000 Russians and send them to labor camps in Siberia. Another 100,000 are just straight up executed, thrown against a brick wall and shot, or dragged down to the woods and shot in mass graves. 300,000 to 500,000 Cossacks are killed or deported again to Siberia, to these prison camps out in the cold wasteland to die. All Mensheviks, all other groups in the Communist Party that didn't agree with Lenin's policies are purged. So they're killing members of their own party for slight disagreements. They seized all church land. They executed many priests. Arguably, you could say this was modeled on France's reign of terror. And it killed way more people than the reign of terror. And you have this quote from Lenin. Or sorry, this is not from Lenin. This is from an upper commissar member of Lenin's government. To overcome our enemies, we must have our own socialist militarism. We must carry along with us 90 million out of the 100 million of Soviet Russia's population. As for the rest, we have nothing to say to them. They must be annihilated. So right here, they're like, we're going to get 90 million of the 100 million Russians. They're going to side with us one way or another. As for the 10 million who disagree with us, we will annihilate them. So absolutely, this is violation of human rights. This is violence. This is conflict. You have all sorts of stuff in here. And here's a pro-Lenin political cartoon. He's seen as, this guy sweeping out the monarchs, sweeping out the nobles, sweeping out the church, the corrupt priests, and sweeping out the capitalists. Remember, top coat, all that stuff. And again, another one of these political cartoons. Who is in charge of Russia? Well, it says Lenin's Russia. He is in charge. What elements of pre-revolutionary Russian society are the Bolsheviks getting rid of? The Tsar and the nobles, the church, and capitalism. Purge that from society. So Lenin's purge is successful, i.e. its goal is to give him all the power and the Bolsheviks all the power, and it does. But success at the cost of literally hundreds of thousands of dead people, hundreds of thousands sent to these brutal labor camps in Siberia. But the economy is still in the crapper. It's not doing well. So Lenin realizes, the Russian economy cannot continue being this bad. Eventually, the people will turn against us. Doesn't matter that we have this hardcore group that's willing to do anything. Eventually, this is going to collapse. So in 1921, Vladimir launches the New Economic Policy, or the NEP. Star that, like war communism, comes up a decent amount. The goal, stabilize the economy. We have to get increasing agricultural productivity. We have to fix the problems of wartime communism. How are they going to fix it? Well, no more forced requisitions of wheat from the peasants. Instead, the government's going to take a flat 50% of whatever gets produced. So war communism, you grow 10 tons, the government takes all surplus, so they're taking 9 because it only needs 1 ton to feed a family. Under the New Economic Policy, you grow 10 tons, the government takes 50%, 5 tons. You're left with 5. The peasant gets to sell 4 and get to keep their 1 ton to feed their family plus some cash. So it allows small-scale capitalism. Please star that for me. A huge element of the NEP is Lenin's kind of already admitting capitalism doesn't really work. The idea that we must take 1 step backwards to take 3 leaps forward in the future. Farmers were allowed to sell their surplus grain and food on a free market, and that created incentives to produce more food. When you can make a profit, you'll work harder. This is one of the main problems with why communism doesn't work. When you don't get anything extra from working harder, you won't work harder. Also, under the New Economic Policy, Lenin realizes it is still important to control certain elements of society. So like steel production, weapon production, still controlled by the government. Banks, still controlled. All foreign trade will be controlled through the central government. Communication, railways, propaganda machines, newspapers, all of that will still be controlled by the Bolsheviks, by the Soviet government. But the NEP is successful. It does allow the Russian economy to recover. You see a 40% increase in agricultural production within 1 year. By 1928, Russia was producing more than Russia had been before World War I. So not only did they make up lost ground, they were being more productive than they had been under the Tsarist regime. But some communists saw this as a step towards capitalism because it was capitalism. Literally, when you're allowing people to sell stuff and buy stuff on a free market and keep the profit, that's literally kind of the definition of capitalism. Of course, if you were too loud in speaking out, like, hey, Lenin, isn't this just capitalism? The Cheka, the secret police, would come and kill you. So again, Lenin is consolidating his control. He's firmly in charge. In 1922, feeling that there have been great strides and success, the Russian Civil War is over. The announcement is made of the creation of a new nation and government, the United Soviet Socialist Republic, or the USSR. This then is the new government of Russia that emerges out of this 5 years of revolution and civil war and strife and violence. In Russia, it's known as the CCCP. Please don't ask me to pronounce that in Russian. It means the same thing, United Soviet Socialist Republic. It just is the Russian language version of it. What it was is several supposedly autonomous republics under a central government of Russia, under Moscow. The capital here will be moved back to Moscow. And what they ended up getting is most of the Russian Empire's territory. They reconquered Estonia, Latvia, and all these former countries that kind of won their freedom. The Red Army reconquered. The Bolsheviks remained communist, and this USSR will be ruled by a dictatorship of the party. It is not ruled by the proletariat. They do not bring in actual democratic voting. There is no freedom. There's no nothing like what Karl Marx eventually envisioned as what society would become. However, under the changes of the NEP, the economy does slowly recover. Life arguably slowly gets better. The Soviets expand education, increasing education for millions of people. The literacy rates in Russia, in the next 5-10 years go rapidly rising to nearly 75, then 80, then 85%. And they write a constitution that will supposedly govern their country. And the Soviet Constitution is a fascinating read. It actually gives them like tons of rights that are like in our Bill of Rights. Arguably, it might even give them more rights, but they just obviously didn't follow them, especially under our next leader, who will be Joseph Stalin. Lenin dies in 1924. St. Petersburg, the former capital of the Russian Empire, founded by Peter the Great, is renamed Leningrad, or City of Lenin, in his honor. And propaganda is used to make him seem like he was the savior of Russia. And that will set the stage for our next time period in Russia under Joseph Stalin.